104, English 104, the freshman comp class does teach the generic research paper. It does. They do. But there's a lot of controversy about the transferability of those skills to different disciplines and other courses. So it's really easy to blame the freshman comp English teachers. We may need to cut them a little slack because there are a lot of disciplinary differences that happen later on. Plus there's a guy that, now to the other side, Bill Marsh wrote a great book, it's called Plagiarism, and his theory is that actually they started the research paper assignment in that class to try to get students to do better research, but actually his theory is that it contributes to plagiarism. That we've started this whole thing about teaching the freshman comp paper, that generic 104 type of thing, but actually because it's artificial, because every major comes in and takes this class and we plop down a topic on them and we say go find a bunch of sources then to integrate, that they actually learn that, even if it's not copy and pasting plagiarism, they learn bad research skill writing from that artificial exercise, which I thought was kind of an interesting point. You know, so I think you in disciplinary, if you're in different disciplines, I think you have a great opportunity to say, okay, we know you guys come from different prep levels, different disciplines. This is my, as Rebecca said, this is my discipline, this is what I expect, you know, because they do have a lot of different levels. So if you have a student who actually works for, let's say, a corporation or even a nonprofit, a lot of times when they put brochures together, let's say, you know, an organization, I don't want to use one that I can think of because y'all probably have some association with it, but let's just take a nonprofit organization, and your job is to put together a brochure to be given out in a clinic situation or something like that. Basically, it's going to be for a general information for a general audience, and you're probably not going to say, you know, with a Chicago or whatever style you use, where you got that. And it may just even have a list of general sources at the end. So audience, a lack of awareness of audience, it does plague our students because they see it and it's right in one context and it's not right in the other. And that's what happens, I think, a lot of times. I feel that the documentation style books sometimes are a little bit behind, because when people come in and ask us really complicated questions on citation, I have to kind of look at the documentation guide and go, okay, well, part of the answer's on this page and part of the answer's on this page, and we're going to have to cobble together what really applies in your particular circumstance. And then I always say ask your professor, you know, is our big, you know, thing to do. But sometimes when I read the documentation guides, it's a little bit difficult to figure out too. And I don't think I've ever had a situation where everybody agrees on everything, which does make it a bit difficult for faculty. I mean, to tell you the truth, because, well, so-and-so said this was fine in her class or his class, but it's not okay in your class. I got a B on that paper in this class, and now I'm doing another paper, and you're sending me to the Honors Council. You know, I'm not saying, I'm not taking a side at all, you guys, but I think that for faculty it's a moving target, and for students it's a moving target for sure. Intentional, that's my hammer and my nail. Okay, you know. Now, lazy, sloppy, there are things, lazy, sloppy, bad research skills, you know, they're just cutting corners. There's a possibility that they're cutting corners and they don't think they're cheating. I think at 2 in the morning, students do have these ethical dilemmas with themselves, you know, stuff, and they say, well, I'm going to cut corners. If I am explicit, and what I don't mean by explicit is, we have some friends from Tarleton here today, but at Texas A&M College Station, you have to put the academic integrity statement on your syllabus. But to me, that's not explicit. No. It's a requirement, but it's not explicit. So how explicit you are in designing your assignments, which we'll talk about a little bit later, may determine your ability to make difficult decisions at the back end. Plus, if you do send somebody to Honors Council, you have all of the paperwork that says, I did this, this is what I expect. There's lots of reasons why students plagiarize, and there's lots of research on this. This is like one of the most over-researched topics I've ever seen in my life, but we still don't have an answer, which is so fascinating. You know, I mean, like my lit review was like, you know, I mean, I kept over and over. I was like, okay. A lot of them ask students to self-report, And all of a sudden they say, did you do it, yes or no? So it's kind of seen in a binary way, which really doesn't get us a good answer. And also self-reporting. But there have been a lot of studies that say, why do these students plagiarize? I'm sure students have been, faculty have been saying this for, longer than I've been alive. Why do they do this? Well, it used to be all the previous research talked about, like, they have character flaws, right? They're deviants. Ooh, they're female or they're male, that there's some biological or psychological reason that these students are not just plagiarists but cheaters. Well, a lot of the contemporary research says not so much. That the same student in one class would never think of plagiarizing, but in another class that student would. It's situational and contextual. Now, you've got some on both ends. You've got students who would never, ever plagiarize. I'm telling you the truth, these students would never, ever plagiarize. And then you have students who would plagiarize no matter what you do. I don't think that we're going to be able to change that. But there's this big group in the middle that probably we can affect. And most of the research recently has talked about contextual influences. Some of that has to do with peers. The research that the McCabe and Trevino and some of these other experts have done say, actually, peer influence is the strongest influence on a student, on a college student, in terms of plagiarizing, cheating, whatever. That is something that can be handled maybe on an institutional level. Here we have honor codes, which makes it a fascinating study, whether it works or doesn't work or whatever. But the next thing, the next step, because you're not their peers, you're the professors, the next step is faculty and how they design their assignments, their classroom environments, the situations that the students perceive them to be in. So let's go ahead and talk about the Turnitin.com thing, because if you're talking about a hammer and a nail, Turnitin.com is about the best hammer or the biggest hammer, but a lot of people find that that's very controversial in terms of the way it's used. But what you're doing is you're empowering the students and saying, okay, I'm going to put the responsibility now in your area, right? It seems to me in a particular time frame, we've gone from very individualized instructions to students. You do your own project, you do this, you turn in your own work. Now students in grade school, high school, college are taught more teamwork, more collaboration, more collaborative projects, and they understand teamwork and they understand collaboration, but what they don't understand is where that line is. And so we've almost created our own problem, because we say, okay, and they love collaboration, but they love collaboration to the point that it's plagiarism, or at least dishonest if it's not plagiarism. So I think that we really, in terms of defining these team projects and stuff like that, that Turnitin.com, what a great instructive way of using it. I've seen people use it where they say, okay, I want you to run your papers through Turnitin.com, and then I want you to have this or that or the other. As a writing teacher, I would also use it to teach good writing skills, not just plagiarism. Because even if they've cited their sources correct, it may not be plagiarism, you guys, but you don't want to read bad writing either, do you? There's a kind of a fine line there. You kind of go, people have taken sources and they've quoted it and they've attributed it, but it's still a really, really bad paper. So I think you can also use Turnitin.com to show, like, this has been quoted, it's cited correctly, but the student has lost his or her voice, right, throughout the paper, because quote, 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 it's like thumping through the forest. The student has no voice in that. It's just this big, monstrous piece of mess. This is where Turnitin.com can help as well, if you're trying to teach them style, and how to understand style. I do the honors remediation classes with Matt. Fascinating. I love doing that. And this idea of who owns what, a lot of students don't think it's that big a deal to collaborate anymore. They also don't kind of understand that sense of ownership. And I try to tell the honors remediation students that if you're a professor and you publish your research in a journal, that's the way you make your reputation. If you go to a corporation and you work for a corporation and you do work for that corporation, you invent something or you come up with a new idea or solution, you don't own that, but the corporation does. And if you go to a new corporation, you can't take that with you. More than likely, it belongs to them. Ownership makes the world turn in this culture. Okay, that idea of capitalism and ownership of ideas, that a lot of times they don't get that. So I was working with one honors remediation student. He said, well, I'm a senior, I'm graduating, yada, yada, yada. I got to sit through this class, blah, blah, blah. I said, what are you going to do? He goes, oh, I got to get a job working for a baseball memorabilia company. I said, this couldn't be a better setup if I planned it myself. I said, what happens if you get a fake? What if you get this, you're representing this player who has signed this ball, it's worth $50,000. What if there's a fake autograph? Well, it waters down everything. It makes that value go down overall. I said, duh, yeah. Right? And so a lot of times we have to be explicit with our students and say, look, this idea, I had a grad student come to me and say, I did this mathematical modeling for my PhD research. This fellow in this other country said, I'm having a problem with whatever. I didn't understand any of it. I'm having a problem with this. He goes, I think my mathematical modeling will help you with your research problem. So they collaborated. It did help them with his research, some kind of scientific research. The guy disappeared off the planet, off the grid, wouldn't write him back his emails. And so where he was that guy had taken his mathematical modeling, was publishing it in a journal. The guy spent 4 years of research on this mathematical modeling. His whole career is shot. I tell that to students when I'm talking about plagiarism because they don't get it. They think, what's the big deal of cutting a corner on it at 2 o'clock in the morning? We know it's a big deal. That's how we make our livelihood. So I just try to be a little more explicit with the students. And what you said was so perfect. You do this on a job, you're getting fired. They may not understand because they don't want to be professors. A lot of them, some of them do, some of them don't. Some of the grad students do, but they understand fired. They understand that, okay? How do I know? Because I'm not an expert in the field. I'll say, okay, put the topic in Google Scholar, and you can turn on the advanced preferences as well and see, there's an advanced preference where you can do all kinds of like dates, all kinds of stuff. But then every time you put in a topic on Google Scholar, it'll say cited by X number of people, and then it will say related articles, similar articles. Now, I really like using the library databases, and I show them how to do that, but sometimes they find that to be a little overwhelming at first. So I start with the Google Scholar, then I get into the library databases from there. Because that way I say, I promise them it's as easy to find a good source as it is a bad source, and I'll show you in less than 30 seconds.